If you grew up in a non-denominational Baptist-leaning church like I did, odds are you're very familiar with the music of Hillsong Worship or Hillsong United. You likely sang their songs at church almost every Sunday. Growing up, I was heavily involved with various praise and worship bands. I would play guitar at church on Sundays and lead chapel worship at the Christian school I attended, and Hillsong was some of my favorite music to play. I mean, you gotta admit that Oceans is kind of a banger. Even now, as someone who's non-religious, listening to Oceans still pulls at my heartstrings. When I was younger, I only had peripheral knowledge of what Hillsong was. I knew it was a megachurch based out of Australia that produced some killer music, but that's pretty much all I knew. As I got older, became an adult, and underwent a process of deconstruction that ultimately led to my departure from Christianity, I still didn't know too much about the church behind the music I loved as a kid. The first exposure I had to the dark side of Hillsong was 2 years ago when I heard about Carl Lentz and his extramarital affairs. Carl was the lead pastor of Hillsong New York, a Hillsong church plant that is known for its celebrity congregants. For example, Carl was a close and personal friend of Justin Bieber's and even baptized him in the home of NBA star Tyson Chandler.
I just want to love Carl more.
You're doing a good job with that.
In 2020, Carl admitted publicly to having a 5-month affair with a woman named Reneen Kareem after Carl's wife Laura discovered salacious text messages between the two. The scandal not only led to Carl's termination by Hillsong founder and senior pastor Brian Houston, but was also the tipping point to the eventual exposure of Hillsong's long history of abuse and misconduct. In March of 2022, a 3-part docuseries titled Hillsong, a Megachurch Exposed premiered on Discovery+. The series exposed Hillsong's decades-long history of abuse and scandal, aided by the stories of various ex-members. I was really excited to watch this documentary. Even though I'm still partial to Hillsong's music, I'm very curious about the underbelly of evangelical churches like Hillsong. I watched the entire documentary twice, but honestly, I was left with mixed feelings. At first, I couldn't put my finger on why that was, but then I came to a realization. The documentary team did do a terrific job of exposing the abuse that happened in Hillsong, but they dug very little into the larger system that spawned this abuse in the first place. It felt like they were really trying to frame Hillsong as an isolated case of church gone wrong, like Hillsong is the bad apple in the bunch. They steered clear of addressing evangelical Christianity as a whole, and instead compared Hillsong and its leaders to fringe and extremist Christian personalities like Kenneth Copeland. As someone who grew up in evangelical churches, nothing that was exposed in the documentary surprised me. In fact, as sad as this is to say, I found it to be rather mundane, because what happened and is still happening in Hillsong is happening in evangelical churches across the world. Hillsong doesn't represent the bad apple in the bunch, but instead represents an inherent problem with religious organizations that believe their singular purpose is to convert and grow their numbers. In today's video, I'm going to be bringing back my husband, Drew, from Genetically Modified Skeptic. Together, we'd like to compare and contrast the scandals that rocked Hillsong to our experiences growing up in the evangelical church and why we believe Hillsong is a symptom of a larger problem. I'm going to discuss Hillsong scandals categorically, with each section of this video examining a different type of abuse. I'll begin each section with a brief synopsis of what happened in Hillsong, followed by an unscripted discussion between Drew and myself. Before we dive in, I do want to give a content warning. In this video, we'll be discussing religious trauma, as well as discussing SA and SA involving minors. To hopefully avoid demonetization, we'll be using some vague terminology to describe some of this stuff, but viewer discretion is still advised. Hillsong believes in something called the Seven Mountain Mandate, which is a movement popular in Pentecostal and charismatic churches. Its adherents believe that to bring about the end times, Christians must gain control of the 7 realms of society: family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. It's no surprise then that several of those interviewed for the documentary said that Hillsong has always been fixated on global expansion.
Brian Houston's endgame is success and victory in this life and the next. They don't just want to save souls. Ultimately, it is about conquering territories bit by bit. And whatever it takes to achieve that, they're in a battle for everything. They really do believe that they need to conquer earth in order to make heaven on earth.
Since its founding in 1983, Hillsong has been on a mission to grow their church into this global empire. In 1993, Brian Houston wrote a mission statement for the church titled "The Church I See." In it, he said, "The church that I see is a church of influence, a church so large in size that the city and nation cannot ignore it, a church growing so quickly that buildings struggle to contain the increase. Yes, the church I see could well be our church, Hillsong Church." World domination requires money, though, and lots of it. Hillsong has funded their global expansion and gained international recognition, partly through their music. In 2017 alone, Hillsong generated $14 million in revenue from their music production, all of which was tax-free, by the way. Collectively, their bands produced 54 albums since their founding, and their song Oceans, that I love so much, reached double platinum in the US. Today, Hillsong has 30 churches across the world bearing their name and an undisclosed number of affiliate churches. They estimate that 50 million people sing their songs at church every single week. They host multiple annual conferences in cities like London and Sydney, where thousands upon thousands attend, and they even have 2 college campuses, one in Sydney and one in Phoenix, Arizona, offering courses in leadership and ministry. They're not only working hard to fulfill their mission statement, but are also working hard to fulfill the 7 Mountain Mandate. But as many interviewed for the documentary pointed out, the problem with a singular church growing to the size of Hillsong is that it's no longer a church, it's a corporation.
When a church becomes this large and has this much power, what are they trying to achieve?
It's not a church.
The thing is, Hillsong actually is a corporation. They operate a broad network of LLCs, all under the Hillsong umbrella, to protect the church from liability in the event they're sued for abuse or misconduct. Barry Bowen, a private investigator interviewed for the documentary, said that when a church is structured this way, it's usually indicative of financial corruption.
There is a famous Bible verse where Jesus said, "You cannot serve God and money." When your goal is to serve God and get rich at the same time, it can create all kinds of moral compromises.
Moral compromises, indeed. Recently, Hillsong has come under fire for using church donations to fund their pastors' lavish lifestyles. Several of those interviewed said that tithe money is often allocated to church credit cards that are then used on extravagant purchases, like booking 5-star hotels or fancy dinner parties. Leaders at a now closed church plant in Ukraine said they were required to send a portion of their tithes back to Australia to support some sort of senior pastor global fund. Carl Lentz, the now disgraced hipster pastor from New York, who spent his free time hanging out with celebrities, was regularly seen wearing designer clothing, including a hoodie from a collaboration between Louis Vuitton and Supreme that at the time was selling for $10,000 to $15,000. Hillsong's fearless leader, Brian Houston, is a multi-millionaire, and he and his wife, Bobby, live in a $4 million mansion just outside of Sydney. While the Brian Houstons and the Carl Lentzes of Hillsong are living it up, their vast army of volunteers works tirelessly without compensation to keep their church running. We'll explore the abuse inflicted on volunteers in the next section. So something that stood out to me pretty much immediately after watching the documentary was that people that were interviewed for the documentary were like shocked that Hillsong wanted to take over the world, and they were like acting like that was a unique or crazy thing that Hillsong wanted to do. And in my mind, I'm thinking this is evangelical Christianity. That's kind of the point. Like, it's about evangelism and taking the message to people that haven't heard it before and growing their church and saving more souls. So to me, I was like, that's not shocking. That's to be expected.
Exactly. Evangelicalism gets its name from the word evangelizing, which means spreading the message to others. But I mean, even before evangelicalism became a thing, I mean, it's basically an American-born sect of Protestant Christianity. Christianity was in the business of trying to preach the gospel to everyone, to the whole world. I mean, one of the reasons why Christianity got so big so fast is because it was basically the first religion in history that had as one of its main priorities evangelizing, spreading the message to others. Before that, there were religions that did have missionaries, things like Manichaeism, even Buddhism had some missionaries, but there wasn't some central tenet saying you have to convert other people.
I don't think my subscribers know this actually, but I grew up as a missionary kid. So to me and to everyone I was around, evangelizing was Christianity. That was an extremely important aspect of Christianity.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of my childhood hoping that the people that I was interacting with would come to know Christ.
Some of the people interviewed in the documentary talk about how Hillsong was after like world domination. And yeah, I guess you can say it that way, but the people who are in the documentary saying that, at least some of them were Christians themselves.
I think most of them were Christians.
I think so. And I just have to ask them, isn't that what you want too? Don't you want the message of Christ to dominate the whole world, to infiltrate every single level of society? That is often what Christianity is. You can call it world domination, and it makes it sound so nefarious. And I mean, I personally think that it is quite nefarious. But most Christians wouldn't say they want world domination. They would say they want everyone to come to receive salvation and you know, have a relationship with Christ or something like that.
They want everyone to convert to Christianity, but not just to Christianity, to their particular flavor of Christianity.
Yeah.
No, I think that like it might be that the Christians that were interviewed, maybe they don't actually want or are trying to proselytize necessarily, but I think that they would still be happy if people converted to Christianity. So like they're hoping for that still.
Yeah.
Hillsong believed in the 7 Mountain Mandate, which is something that's particular to charismatic and Pentecostal churches. But I think most evangelical churches are kind of following the 7 Mountain Mandate, even if they don't call it that, because if we look at evangelicals, especially in America, they do want to have control over the media. They do want to have their leaders in politics. They do want to have their beliefs taught in schools. So they are following the 7 Mountain Mandate, even if they don't call it that.
Right.
So a big topic of the documentary was how much financial abuse was happening in Hillsong. But I think that has to do mostly with the sheer size of Hillsong. And I think that most churches, given the opportunity to have the power and influence that Hillsong did, would likely have the same problems occurring in their church too. One of the people that was interviewed for the documentary had this quote that I really, really liked. They said, I think people can get into preaching for the right reasons and with the best intentions, but getting the fame and getting the attention as a species, we're not good with power. Power corrupts. I think this is true not just for churches. I think that anyone that gets a massive amount of power is like bound to abuse that power.
Yeah, this is human nature.
This is human nature.
Again, it's painted in this documentary like Hillsong was bad because it wanted this much power. But I really think that especially evangelical churches, but many other church leaders, even people who try to run their congregation quite ethically and are good people, want this level of power because, again, they want to spread the message of Jesus, and getting this much power is a way to do it. There are a couple of reasons why I think people don't necessarily grow as big as Hillsong. One is that there are some ethical constraints that people place on themselves that don't allow themselves to manipulate others in a way which would allow them to amass such a following. But two, and maybe more importantly, I just don't think that most people are marketing geniuses like those who are behind Hillsong. Yeah,
everyone at Hillsong was marketing geniuses, that's for sure.
Yeah. Another point I have to make about the financial aspect of this is that churches in the US and in Australia don't have very much oversight.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have to pay taxes, and even when there are regulations on what they can and can't say, such as promoting some politician, that the IRS, at least in the US, often don't investigate that at all. I mean, there are hundreds of instances just through Trump's reign in America alone that go viral and the IRS never investigates them. I mean, these churches, I think, do suffer from financial corruption because they get so big, but also it doesn't help that there's very, very little oversight from any regulatory body, much less the government.
Even when a church is basically operating as a business, which Hillsong was.
Absolutely.
Like, they're pretty much, like, partly a production company, a media and music production company, and yet there's no oversight. They're not having to pay taxes. They can kind of just do what they want.
Right.
Part of the reason that Hillsong got as big as it did was because of their music. What they were doing was basically producing this music and then selling it to churches, and most evangelical churches across the world play Hillsong music.
Whether the congregation even knows it or not.
Yeah. And why they were able to do this is because their music was simply better than everybody else's. They were really, really good at eliciting emotion from people, and
especially the specific emotions that a congregation leader might want the congregation to feel in order to be receptive to their message.
Yeah, there's actually a really good quote that I want to read from someone interviewed for the documentary. They said, "These swells of emotion and huge momentous chord progressions, it's made to make you feel something. They want you to feel the presence of God within you, but it's easy to mistake emotional manipulation for a moment of God, right?" And that kind of reminded me of your video that you made where you're talking about how church service is kind of designed to emotionally manipulate you. So I thought that you'd have some like good thoughts on this.
Yeah, what I talk about in that video is that church services are designed to elicit certain emotions that make you receptive to the message that's going to be spoken that day. Now, I don't think that emotionally engaging a crowd with music is inherently wrong. I mean, I've gone to concerts and felt incredibly emotional, and that's fine. There's no problem with that. The problem arises when you start telling the group of people that you're playing music to that any emotions they feel you're not responsible for eliciting. It wasn't you. It was God himself.
Yeah.
First of all, this means that you're kind of impersonating God, which even from a Christian perspective, that's blasphemy, right? That's unethical. But also from a secular perspective, it creates the problem of a lack of informed consent. People think that the emotions that they're feeling are from God. Yet it's quite obvious from an outside perspective that no, the worship leaders are actually responsible for this. But this isn't something that in many churches you can acknowledge without people thinking that you're trying to belittle their faith or trying to just insult the leaders and call them incredibly unethical.
I think a lot of people do see it as like the music is an instrument for God to work through, or it's a tool for God to work through. I mean, that's what I thought when I was younger and like was on praise and worship teams. So I think that's how they have it in their head. But the thing is that can't be demonstrated. And so when someone's feeling something during a church service, who's to say it is God? Who's to say it's just the worship band playing really good music?
Mm-hmm. And when the leaders are pushing the narrative that no, this is God, you have to believe that it's God, and if you insinuate anything, you imply anything otherwise, then that's
insulting.
It's insulting to us. It creates an incredibly unstable and unethical power dynamic. People basically get free rein to manipulate the audience, the crowd, without any accountability, because anything that they feel was God's will. You don't think of the people who are leading as people, really. You think of their effects as being from God, while not holding them accountable for the effects that they're actually eliciting.
I think there's a difference when you're getting yourself into an emotional state, like if it's self-induced, because basically what you're doing is initiating a ritual. And when you're intrinsically motivated and you know that you're putting yourself into that, I think that that's different because that's informed consent versus when it's someone else putting you in that state for some reason to have some type of outcome that you can't control, then I think that's a different thing. Because for me, like I was, I talked about this in the intro of the video, but I was really active on praise and worship bands. And like I played a lot of worship music on my own, on my guitar. And I look back on that time of my life with pretty fondly, because I think for me, I was always intrinsically motivated to do that. It wasn't something that someone was forcing me to do or putting me into some type of state to get some desired outcome. It was something I was doing for myself. Yeah. And I think that is different.
Unfortunately, one of the outcomes of that video that I made was there were people, is pretty much exclusively Christians and apologists, who directly responded to me in videos of their own, saying that I'm against ritual inherently. And look, Drew says the same parting words in every video, so that shows that he's hypocritical in condemning ritual. No, I don't think that ritual is wrong. I mean, I have a pagan friend who has led rituals and is involved with a community that believes in gods, and they commune together to worship gods. However, I don't have an issue with that, because informed consent is something that everyone has to enter into before he'll even allow anyone into the ritual space. Yeah. That should be the bare minimum, and this is not something that churches typically do.
No, and they're saying, hey, we know this is a ritual that's going to get you into a certain emotional state. And that could be God, but that could just as likely not be God.
Yeah.
Versus I feel like with most evangelical churches, they're saying, no, this is most likely God that's doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm not against ritual. I'm against foregoing informed consent and claiming that any emotion that you elicit out of the congregation came from God, not you.
Yeah. Like most churches, Hillsong's day-to-day operations are facilitated by an army of volunteers. Volunteerism in a church setting isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when a church is operating as a business, this volunteerism is actually unpaid labor.
You're required to serve at the church during the weekend. You're required to serve at the college in the chapels, and you're required to serve in your internship. I was editing their programs for free as part of my college.
Brando Kress, a volunteer that worked the lighting system for Hillsong New York, said that the church targets young people looking for community by appealing to popular culture. Hillsong New York in particular is known for its nightclub vibe and cool hipster pastors. Once sucked in, the church preys on their new members' eagerness to serve. They begin asking them to work increasingly long hours without compensation. Brando recalled telling church leaders that he wasn't able to put more hours into volunteering and that they'd probably need to hire someone to manage their lighting. He said they responded with, well, we don't want to pay anyone, so you should just train more volunteers to help you. Every year, Brian Houston comes up with a new lingo or catchphrase that catches on with Hillsong members. Naomi Aribe, a volunteer at Hillsong Boston, recalled that one year the lingo was, "Do you believe we get to do this?" Naomi said that this lingo was used to motivate exhausted volunteers to keep working for the church.
You'd be exhausted, you'd be tired, people would have panic attacks in the break rooms. And everyone would just look at each other and be like, wow, do you believe we get to do this?
You know, it's not a good look for a church when on Sunday their wannabe rock star pastor rolls up in a limo while volunteers are having panic attacks in the break room. Volunteerism is really important, I feel like, in the evangelical church, and they place high importance on having a servant heart or servanthood in general, and like you should be doing things because this is what Jesus would do, and he would sacrifice all of his time and resources in order to help other people.
Yeah.
And so I think that's like a really big thing that's in most evangelical churches. For me, growing up, I wasn't involved heavily in volunteerism other than like being on the praise and worship band and like doing things that I was required to do for school. But most of that had to do with like I have social anxiety, and like a lot of volunteerism involves being social with people. So that was always a hard thing for me to do. But I definitely like was instilled with this like servant mindset. And I kind of took that into adulthood, and I think I still even now tend to devalue myself or devalue my time. So one of the first jobs I had when I was in college was working for Panera Bread.
I remember that.
And at the time I was, studying full time, and I was also training for my pilot's license. So I was like super busy already, but I was like, I want to have extra money. So I decided to try to get a job at Panera. I only lasted a week because I realized it was just like way too intense and too much work for me. So when I like gave my notice that I didn't want to work there anymore, I like told the boss that like they didn't have to pay me for that first week because I only worked a week and like I didn't show my commitment to the company or whatever. And I remember the boss telling me like, no, like we're legally required to pay you. Even if you only worked like 15 minutes, we have to pay you. And I didn't even think about that because in my mind, I'm like, I have to be self-sacrificial and I have to take the L on this because I didn't like hold up my end of the bargain.
I remember you feeling pretty guilty about getting paid for only working a week.
Yeah.
I was like, what are you talking about?
And now looking back on that, it's like, it was my decision whether or not I worked there. I don't owe this company something, but back then that's the mindset I had from like my Christian background.
Yeah.
And then even after college, when I like got my first big boy job working for the airlines, they actually asked me how much I wanted to be paid, and I think I like severely undersold myself because I was thinking like I have no experience. I'm fresh out of college. Like I need to like lowball them because that's what I should do. Looking back on that now, it's like I undersold myself. Like I had value. I had the education. I had the character for the job. I should have actually asked for what would have been an appropriate salary for myself.
Also, speaking as somewhat of an outsider to that situation, if you saw the work that Taylor did, in comparison, I'm just going to say in comparison, you should have gotten paid more than a lot of other people.
I was doing a lot of work that like wasn't in my job description. So yeah. I think that even if Hillsong hadn't been requiring their volunteers to work these super long hours, their volunteers would have still done that anyways because they've been taught by the church that in order to be a good person, you need to be super self-sacrificial and like giving of your time and your energy.
Sometimes people in leadership in churches can also get away with shaming people and emotionally manipulating people because if you feel convicted, like you should be working more, if you feel shame, basically because I've shamed you, that wasn't my responsibility. That wasn't my doing. You don't feel shamed because I'm shaming you or we have a shameful, work too hard kind of culture. It's that God, the Holy Spirit is convicting you. If you feel bad, that is God speaking to you and telling you, you need to do more work for me. This is the same problem as with worship. If you are invoking an emotion in a group of people that you're supposedly serving, you can just hide behind, no, that was God eliciting that emotion in you, not me. So it allows you to completely escape moral accountability for things that you're doing.
Yeah. It was public knowledge that Carl Lentz was a womanizer and a player long before news broke about his affair with Reneen Kareem. For example, an anonymous source interviewed for the documentary said that Carl, who regularly harped on sexual purity during his sermons, had tried to sleep with her friend while he was a youth pastor, a married youth pastor, at Wave Church in Virginia. Jacqueline Hayes, another ex-member of Wave Church, said that Carl laid out strict dating rules for church members and would drill it into their heads that sex before marriage was a sin. So when Jacqueline and her then boyfriend slept together for the first time, they felt obligated to confess their sin to Carl.
It was literally one time, and Carl asked, "Did you use protection?" And I interrupted, "Yes, of course we used protection, And his next response was, well then it was premeditated."
As punishment, Carl removed Jacqueline from her position of leadership at the church and forced her and her boyfriend to break up. When Jacqueline heard about Carl's sex scandal years later, she was shocked that the person who had shamed her for being intimate with her partner had a laundry list of moral failings of his own.
When all this came out, I was really mad. It just makes you very angry that the same thing you were shamed with is the same thing that, it is literally the definition of a hypocrite.
Bailey Krozik, a student of Hillsong College, said that to be permitted to work with children, the school required students to disclose their sexual history. Bailey was nervous about this because she had previously been a victim of SA and at the time felt like the trauma she endured was somehow her fault.
Because of this culture I had grown up in, it was my fault for putting myself in that situation.
When she told college staff about what had happened to her, instead of reassuring her that it wasn't her fault and that she had been SA'd, they framed it as a past sin that required repentance. Another former Hillsong College student, Anna Crenshaw, was SA'd by Hillsong worship leader Jason Mays. When Anna told the church about what had happened to her, they doubted her story and then tried to sweep the situation under the rug. They even allowed Jason to continue holding leadership positions at the church. It wasn't until Anna's father intervened that her story was taken seriously. Clearly, Hillsong has a terrible track record of handling situations involving SA, but the thing is, Hillsong was actually founded on abuse. Frank Houston, one of the founders of Hillsong and father of Brian Houston, repeatedly SA'd minors while he was establishing the church in the 70s. One of Frank's victims was a young boy named Brett Sangstock, who was abused over a period of several years. Brett kept this abuse secret until he was an older teenager and finally confided in his mother. Brett's mother responded to him by saying that he shouldn't talk about this publicly because, in her words, he wouldn't want to be responsible for turning people away from the church and sending them to hell. She did end up telling Hillsong leaders about what had happened to her son, but as per their standard operating procedures, Hillsong swept the situation under the rug. Instead of being concerned about the victim, Hillsong and its leaders were more concerned about caring for Frank and his reputation. Brian even told Brett that it was Brett's fault because he had tempted his father. Hillsong and Brian Houston failed to disclose their knowledge of the crime to the proper authorities and permitted Frank to continue preaching up until 2004. Currently, Brian is in legal hot water over his father's transgressions because failing to report knowledge of a crime is a crime in itself. In the next section, we'll discuss further how Hillsong gaslights its victims and avoids culpability. Okay, so let's talk about Carl Lentz. First of all, that guy, he just gives me, real pastor bro vibes. I feel like if he didn't become a pastor, he would have become, a vlogger, like Jake Paul or something. He actually went on their podcast, Impulsive, last year, I think, or, the year prior. It's that guy just creeps me out. I do not like him. Carl really pushed purity culture. He would be constantly preaching about how, it's a sin if you have sex before marriage, and he had all these weird rules about dating, you weren't allowed to say I love you until you were engaged, and you couldn't kiss your partner. He just had all these weird rules for his congregants. And then you come to find out that while he's been basically guilting people over doing nothing, over having natural urges that are normal, he's running off with supermodels, And I just find that this is really, really common for preachers. It's whatever they are harping on the most is what they themselves are dealing with.
Absolutely.
And I think they feel like they'll be relieved of their guilt or get some sort of forgiveness if they're able to control their followers, as if getting their followers to not do the thing that they fell into the trap of will somehow absolve them.
Something that male leaders do, especially when they have a lot of power, is essentially seek sexual domination over the people in their group that they're leading. One of the ways that you can have sexual dominance over everyone there
by controlling other
people's sexuality. To control their sexuality.
Yeah, limiting their sexuality.
I mean, he's essentially making it to where it gets very primal here. All the women are staying chaste for him. and the men can't do anything to potentially soil all of the women that could be there for him. It's a form of sexual dominance through control and shame. Just because he's not necessarily actually going after all of these women.
Well, he did. One of them.
Not
at least
all
one.
of them. Even though he's not going after all of them, he is seeking to control all of them, which is still a form of sexual dominance.
It's not, he would say it's not him, it's God that wants control.
Yeah, it's
which is still weird.
It's God that wants sexual dominance.
When I was in high school, I went to a Christian high school, an evangelical Christian high school. I had this Bible teacher who would constantly be talking about like sexuality and purity and going into like graphic details about sex acts and how these specific types of sex acts
Christians would call it sodomy.
Oh yeah, that's like I was like trying to think like what word can I use to not get demonetized right now. But yeah, he would go into detail about that, and it would be something that he would like bring up and almost looking back on it, I feel like it was almost every single like class period, but I'm sure it wasn't.
Bible class
period. And which, you know, like that's an inappropriate thing to be bringing up in class. Like for a teacher to be talking about sexual purity and like telling students not to have sex in a Bible class with students who are, you know, 14 and 15 years old is inappropriate in itself. But it's just something that he would harp on so much. And like later, I don't remember if it was after I'd already left the high school or what, but I found out that he had sex before marriage. And so I'm like, oh, that's why you were so like adamant that we didn't, because you felt guilt over that. And my hope for him is though, like he doesn't need to actually feel guilt about that. And he doesn't need to feel like he has to control students and like it's his responsibility to like keep them chaste. Like doesn't have anything to do with him. So I hope maybe now he realizes that. But there were several women that were interviewed for the documentary that had been essayed. And one of them in particular was afraid to talk about their essay because they felt guilt over that. Like they had done something wrong or they had put themselves in that situation or tempted the guy to do that. So like they didn't want to talk about it because of that. And while the environment that I grew up in, like the church that I grew up in, they wouldn't say like, oh, if you got essayed, that's your fault. But we did have so many rules about modesty and not showing PDA with boys. And we were told that that's because if we're showing too much skin or we look sexy, then we're tempting our brother. And if they fall into sin, like we've been
you share the blame.
Yeah, like we've been accomplices to their sin. So stuff like that can easily morph into, oh, you've been essayed, that's because you did something wrong. Right. You were wearing too sexy of a shirt or low cut of a shirt, or you were at the wrong place at the wrong time. At the Christian school I went to, we had so many rules about like what girls could wear, but there weren't that many rules for the guys. Like guys could pretty much wear whatever. Yeah. But for girls, like we had to have shorts down to our knees or skirts down to our knees. We couldn't have spaghetti straps or showing our shoulders. You couldn't have anything tight. And the rules were different for girls who happened to like have boobs or be curvier. It's like they could not wear the same things. And then when it came to the PDA stuff, like I got in trouble for holding hands with my boyfriend one time at school. And then there was this other time where my boyfriend and I were like sitting in this gazebo and there was like this like swinging porch chair basically. And, like we were sitting next to each other and my boyfriend decided to like flip on his back and like put his head in my lap. Like it wasn't like his head was in my crotch. It was like he was just, you know, laying on my lap or whatever. And this teacher comes walking by and like goes up to us and says that we like can't be sitting like that. And she like makes us like walk in opposite directions. And I'm like, we're out here in a gazebo that's within eye shot of basically everybody. And like you're upset. Like, what do you think's gonna happen? Like, nothing's gonna happen.
Yeah.
And there was this other time where, like, our school had this, like, multi-purpose room where we did, like, concerts and where we had chapel every single week. Hey, guys, editing Taylor here. So I need to add a bit of detail to this story that I forgot to mention when we were filming. But the reason that I mentioned that my school has an NPR is because the story I'm about to tell occurred in that NPR. So I'm pretty sure that this happened when my school was having chapel. So every single student was present, every single grade, guys and girls. I remember pretty vividly that the teacher in the story I'm about to tell, when they approached me, there were multiple people around me that heard this all go down. So that's just a little bit extra detail to kind of make this story make a little bit more sense. And one time I was like laying on the ground with like my feet up.
Yeah.
And I guess it looked like a certain position that people take in certain situations. I probably didn't look like that.
No.
But a teacher came up to me and said, oh, you're not allowed to like lay like that. Like you need to like cross your legs or something because that's like gonna send signals to the boys that you're like open for whatever. Or like that's gonna make them like have dirty thoughts or something.
And if some boy crossed a boundary in that situation, then it would be your fault.
Yeah. And like that, that's all to say, like this small stuff like this teaches girls that they are responsible for when something bad happens to them like that.
So when something really bad happens, it doesn't really even have to be said that it's their fault. They just know it already.
Yeah.
I think this works out quite conveniently for the leadership in situations like this because in evangelical environments, all the leaders are men. The people who are not having to actually take responsibility for the outcomes of their actions, like abusing someone or assaulting someone, are men. The leaders then do not have to actually be accountable for the things that they're doing. I mean, they get to just blame their congregation for things that they should be taking responsibility for.
Yeah.
A lot of the time also when scandals like this come out, what the church does and what Hillsong did was essentially spiritualize the problem. They talk about all the spiritual harm that's been done, which allows them to say, oh, look at all the spiritual harm that this man has fallen into and is being made victim of. And then it allows them to just address the spiritual harm that's involved in this situation, which is entirely unmeasurable, intangible. You never know when it could possibly be addressed, so they can basically do whatever they want to address it. And then all the actual, real, tangible, observable harm is just an afterthought. It's a very dangerous environment for victims to be in, where leadership will just spiritualize a problem rather than taking on accountability for actual observable harm. If the spiritual is more important than the actual, then justice doesn't really exist.
Yeah. What Hillsong cares about most is protecting its reputation. They believe their continued existence is paramount to everything else because they're winning souls for the kingdom. It seems they'll do or say practically anything to ensure their church remains intact. Anna Crenshaw and her father ended up going public about how poorly Hillsong handled Anna's essay by Jason Mays. In response, Brian Houston addressed the situation with his parishioners and said that while what Jason did was a crime, they must understand that he's not a bad guy and that he just got drunk and made a stupid mistake. Then, Brian disclosed in a now deleted tweet that Anna had previously been essayed at her father's church. Anna believes, and I agree, that Brian released this information strategically in an attempt to distract from Hillsong. At the time, this information wasn't public knowledge, and Brian publicizing this only traumatized Anna further. Deflection is the name of the game for Hillsong, and valid criticism is often framed as persecution. Instead of taking accountability, they claim that the negative media attention they've received over the last few years is simply the result of Satan attacking them.
There's been so many false and misleading headlines, and people have the media especially have an absolute fixation. It's not just an attack on Hillsong, though. Honestly, it's an attack on all we stand for, our Christian values. And by our Christian values, I mean your Christian values. Everything that many of you stand for.
Recently, Brian stepped down from leadership at Hillsong because it's been revealed that he had sent inappropriate messages to 2 different women. But even now, he's still attempting to paint himself and Hillsong as the true victims. He claims to have sent the inappropriate messages because he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol, as if that excuses his behavior. In an email sent to church members, Brian apologized for his actions. However, he went on to say that he still believes that he's the person and pastor they believed him to be. But because of the years of constant pressure, challenges, and attacks, accompanied by his personal turmoil over his father's evil, he's relied on alcohol to cope. He also claimed that the best is yet to come for Hillsong, a wishful statement for a man who's dug his own grave. Something that annoys me so much about Hillsong and Brian Houston is that even still, they're like denying that they've done anything wrong, and they're framing like all of this negative attention they're getting as like, oh, Satan's just attacking us because like he knows that we're doing good work, and like this is a spiritual battle, not a battle between flesh and blood. And like it just makes it so they can just kind of like cop out of the situation and not take responsibility because they're framing it as
that they're the victims.
That they're the victims.
They're the perpetrators.
Yeah. I don't have any examples from my childhood of like the church or the people I grew up with denying wrongdoing when they have done something wrong. But a lot of the time, like if something bad was happening in the community, it would be framed as like this bad thing's happening because like Satan's attacking us for doing the Lord's work here. There was this one time when a bunch of missionaries were trying to show the Jesus film to some of the locals, and either like the power went out or maybe they had a generator they were trying to use and the generator wasn't working. But for some reason, they weren't able to show the film because there was no electricity. And instead of being like, oh, the generator's not working or the electricity is out, they blamed it on Satan. Like Satan is trying to prevent us from showing this Jesus film because he doesn't want the locals to be saved. It's like instead of just looking at factually what's happening right now, it's like it has to be in some sort of like spiritual sense.
That's a very convenient tool for those who are basically doing PR in churches like Hillsong, where there's been abuse. They can use the spiritual to create whatever narrative they want, because the spiritual is not tangible. The spiritual is not something that you can measure. There's no objectivity. It can be whatever you make up at any point. And so it allows you to create whatever narrative you want. So yeah, Hillsong did all of these horrible things, and there are multiple people who should be in prison for it. But no, the reason why there's been such a tumultuous period in Hillsong's history is because they are the victims. They are being attacked, and I can prove it. They're being
persecuted.
Yeah, and I can prove it as long as you like agree with me theologically.
Yeah, it's like you have to agree with what they believe in order for that to make sense.
Even as an atheist, I think of this in a naturalistic way, but I'll still say that spirituality is a important part of just the human experience. I mean, it's something that can help a person feel like they have purpose and help them with their mental health. Unfortunately, though, it's malleable enough to where it can be twisted into a weapon to bludgeon victims. And the case of Hillsong, I think, demonstrates that, unfortunately, too well.
Yeah. While Hillsong is a popular example of church corruption because of its sheer size and level of influence, it's not as unique as many make it out to be. The beginnings of what Hillsong ultimately became exists in most evangelical churches. If given the money, power, and influence Hillsong has, I think most of these churches would find themselves embroiled in similar scandals. If we truly care about calling out abuse and manipulation, we need to be willing to examine the system behind that abuse rather than just examining individual churches. If we fail to do this, we will allow future Hillsongs to spring up from the root we failed to destroy. Thanks so much for watching, and a huge thank you to my patrons who help make these videos possible. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. If you'd like to follow my socials, my Instagram handle is Taylor_the_Antibot, and my Twitter handle is the Antibot. If you'd like to support this channel financially, a link to my Patreon will be down in the description, and I'll see you all in the next one. Say bye!